This conversation will be looking at a very interesting and emerging aspect within the sector, humanitarian diplomacy. My name is Hiba Ali. I'm the CEO of the New Humanitarian, and I will be your moderator. We're expecting one more panelist. He'll be joining us as soon as he can. The New Humanitarian, as many of you know, is an independent, nonprofit news organization that reports about humanitarian crises around the world, as well as humanitarian policy. So be sure to sign up if you haven't already for our daily and weekly news digest, where you can keep up with trends on aid policy, including what we'll be discussing today. We will be posting on the screen the Wi-Fi code. You probably have it by now, but we will be using it to take your questions. So do log in. And to enter your questions, you'll go to sli.do and then put in the hashtag EHF2023. From there, you'll have to select the room that you're in. So we're in the studio, and the date, the 20th of March. And then you can put in your questions. You can start submitting them already, and I will try to get to them later in the conversation. There is a French speaker among us, so if you didn't hear me screaming earlier, if you don't have a headset, you can grab one outside the room. Pour ceux qui ont besoin de traduction, il y a des casques disponibles dehors. C'est canal 2 pour français. Hay auriculares disponibles para la traducción, canal 3 para español. And it'll be channel 1 for English. All right, housekeeping out of the way. In so many crises around the world, in Afghanistan, we're seeing it now in the Syria earthquake, in occupied areas of Ukraine, limited access to people in need is making it hard to save lives. And add to that the increasingly blatant violations of international humanitarian law, attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, and aid workers themselves. So we're in a situation where needs are skyrocketing, as you heard this morning, and on the flip side, access is increasingly strained. Enter humanitarian diplomacy. And I asked our panelists before we got here today for their definitions of humanitarian diplomacy. I got slightly different answers, so I'm going to share some of them with you. Engaging with political aspects of a humanitarian crisis to craft a deal which helps alleviate suffering. Encouraging and convincing decision makers and opinion leaders to act in the best interest of people affected by humanitarian crises and conflicts. Ou bien, la diplomatie humanitaire est considérée comme un instrument qui permet d'atteindre les personnes les plus vulnérables, un objectif qui s'inscrit dans le programme et l'engagement politique de ne laisser personne de côté. But we thought, who best to define humanitarian diplomacy than the person that some may call, although perhaps it's up for debate, the architect of humanitarian diplomacy, the UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Martin Griffiths. He couldn't be here this afternoon, so we're going to hear his vision of humanitarian diplomacy in a short video, and then we'll get into the discussion.
Sorry I can't be with you in person for this event, but I'm glad this important conversation is taking place at the European Humanitarian Forum. And of course, thank you to the Swedish EU presidency and to the Commission for convening this forum. Today's panel brings together some of the most knowledgeable people and organizations involved with humanitarian diplomacy and with humanitarian access. And indeed, you have much to discuss. Humanitarian diplomacy aims at achieving humanitarian goals by diplomatic means. It is a strategy for influencing parties to pursue humanitarian objectives through leveraging networks of sustained relationships. What makes it different from other humanitarian responses is that it posits a solution and then works out how to get there. Humanitarian diplomacy can be used for many different purposes. For example, it can be used to raise protection issues. We have done this recently in Afghanistan, when the Taliban issued the ban on NGO female employment. It can be used to respond to global humanitarian issues. And we have done this to address global food insecurity through the means of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Humanitarian diplomacy may cover actions to resolve conflicts or stabilize societies where the motivation to do so is humanitarian. And, the topic of today, humanitarian diplomacy can be used to negotiate access. And we've done this most recently in Syria following the earthquake. We have multiple examples of negotiations with non-state armed groups in hard-to-reach areas. And for this, we need to engage with decision makers at the right level. We need to mobilize political support and leverage relationships in favor of humanitarian objectives. We need to use mediation as well as negotiation to fulfill a humanitarian agenda. And all of that, and I stress, needs to be in full respect of humanitarian principles. So for me, personally, humanitarian access has been a leitmotif for most of my career in the humanitarian sector and in conflict mediation. Access is what makes humanitarian assistance and protection possible. Yet, in many places, it is deliberately being blocked. Humanitarians are facing an increasingly challenging environment, including the multiplication of state and non-state actors, increased bureaucratic and administrative impediments, restrictive policies such as sanctions and counter-terrorism measures which impact on access. In armed conflicts from Syria to Somalia, and in some natural disasters, access to communities in need is too often played as a chip in a political game for influence and control. And as a result, and a consequence, aid is not delivered, protection is lacking, and suffering and vulnerability increases. Wherever it is denied, delayed, or obstructed, we need to engage with those blocking it. Employing humanitarian diplomacy to that end is our duty, our responsibility. We need to make the case, we need to win the case for everybody who needs assistance and protection. And this work is a priority for me personally and for OCHA, and we will continue to invest in it. I hope and believe that your debate today will help push for more engagement at all levels, for better policies and approaches, for more capacity to engage in humanitarian diplomacy and access negotiations. I wish you very well, and I thank you.
Just before I jump in, for those of you at the back, there are seats in the front row if you want to come up. So I'm going to jump into the discussion and start with you, Edem. So Edem Osorno is the chief of the response branch of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA. Martin has just expressed his that humanitarian diplomacy is a personal priority for him. He has arguably moved OCHA towards much more humanitarian diplomacy than his predecessors. And I would argue that's due to his own career in conflict mediation for many decades. And OCHA is now ramping up this work, which I hope you'll tell us about a little bit later as part of its new strategy. But humanitarian diplomacy is more political, and for some in the humanitarian world, that is uncomfortable territory, especially when Martin says that humanitarian diplomacy aims to resolve conflicts or stabilize societies, which would be, to my mind, stretching the traditional bounds of humanitarianism. So what do you say to those who would argue that this is taking OCHA away from its core mandate, and why do you see it as a necessary response to the current landscape?
Thanks a lot.
A bit closer.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
No, I think the mic is still not on. Try again.
Thank you so much for the question. I'll keep it moving.
Oh, use the other mic, I think.
Hello?
There we
Yes,
go.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Heba. As you talk about first of all, really happy to be here as access and issues around humanitarian negotiations have plagued humanitarian action for the last 20 years since at least I've been in the business. Two things come to mind immediately. One is the General Assembly Resolution 46-182, which is the resolution that instated OCHA 1991, it's got 40 paragraphs, and it starts with the territorial integrity and sovereignty of a state must be respected in humanitarian action, and it goes all the way through to different, the part that talks about the ERC, Martin Griffiths in this case, will actively facilitate will facilitate access through areas including humanitarian corridors. So the resolution has about 40 paragraphs that touch on the political, human rights, humanitarian development aspects of the entirety of the ERC mandate. So that's where I'll start from. We've always talked about the fact that there's no humanitarian solution to any humanitarian issue. If it's a natural disaster, we're talking about reconstruction, rehabilitation. If it's a conflict, we're talking about negotiations with non-state armed groups. We touch on a few political aspects of a humanitarian crisis. If you go into a country, you need to understand the context. You need to understand the players. You cannot walk in and focus only on the humanitarian. Obviously, we have to toe the line on humanitarian principles. We all know what they are, on neutrality, on impartiality, on independence, and of course, humanity. So of course, it's a constant juggle when it comes to what do you do as a humanitarian in a context where the end result is not based on, you can't give food until kingdom come. Your question, Heba, was very clear. Why are we, what is the struggle with our partners when it comes to, is OCHA going too far? I started OCHA in Darfur in 2004, negotiating with the rebels at the time in Muhajaria, trying to get access to people in need. It was under Egland at the time. Fast forward 20 years later, Griffiths, same thing. Humanitarian action cannot be looked at through the humanitarian lenses alone. And I think the more we look beyond the boundaries of humanitarian action, the better it is for us. And this is coming from somebody who's been a humanitarian for the last 20 years. I'll give you two more examples. 2018, 3 years into the humanitarian response in northeast Nigeria, we're talking about how do we negotiate access with the non-state armed groups. The government being very clear, you are here at the invitation of us. We are fighting a war. Why are you going to negotiate access with what we see as an aggression to our land? We had to negotiate with the government at the highest level, at the federal level, and at the state level to ensure that they understood what we were going for and fettered and hindered humanitarian access. This debate still goes on, where the government tells you the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the state is our problem, not yours. So how do humanitarians understand when we get into a country, recognize that you are there also at the behest and the invitation of government? So it's a constant struggle. There's a lot to talk about in this debate. I will stop here, but I wanted to start with the resolution 1991 and talk also about Martin's vision. But it started in 91 in the resolution and not just with this ERC, Martin Griffiths. Thank you.
Okay, so A, this is for you clear territory for humanitarians, and B, this isn't new. It is newly popular, I would say. And David, I want to turn to you. David Harland, Executive Director of the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. Humanitarian diplomacy is arguably your bread and butter. And one of the most recent successes, as several people have mentioned to me, is the Black Sea Grain Initiative. I'd love to hear how you were very involved in the setup of that deal, how you went about it, and what it says about the power of humanitarian diplomacy. What about the third one?
Hello?
Oh, there we go.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very hard to compete with Obi-Wan Kenobi back there. But yeah, no, I very much I agree with Martin's basic framing of the issue. And certainly when we pitched the idea of the Black Sea deal to the Secretary General in March of last year, it was exactly with that in mind. With the idea that you had to use essentially creative, political, quiet approaches to key stakeholders. And Martin said it so well, I thought, with a specific purpose in mind. So from our perspective, it was very much driven by the fact there was a spike of grain prices on the world market of about 25% in one day, on the 25th of February 2022. And from our perspective, we began from the point of view, what can be done to lower those prices, not what can be done to provide more aid or what would be the application of humanitarian principles in Russia or Ukraine or whatever, and then try to find the architecture of a deal that could take it a certain way. I should say that we sent a note to the UN in March about to the Secretary General, and but almost simultaneously, or a little later, just the International Chamber of Commerce actually had a similar idea and also wrote to the Secretary General about it. And what strikes me as interesting, in a way, is that the idea of a deal that can achieve humanitarian ends through a mixture of political and, in the ICC case, commercial engagement, came from outside the UN, but then required the UN to get it where it was. So in my view, it's quite a positive example of a partnership that can work, where sometimes there are actors who are bound by their own public profiles and by large intergovernmental mandates, and there are partners external who aren't. And I think that worked relatively well.
Can I jump in? Because this morning we were talking in the session about Ukraine, about the challenge of engaging with the Russian government in order to access areas under its control, and that very few, if any, actors were able to do that, and yet you were able to get some traction with the Russian government in this deal. So what was different about your approach?
The first I would say is I do believe there is a role for a neutral organization. I think the United Nations, and actually we see the pressure ICRC has come under in Ukraine. There is enormous pressure, given the polarization of the world and the politicization of everything, to not engage in a neutral way with all parties to the conflict. It's very painful, and I thought that the emotion and actually, but also the sort of intellectual power of the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister was really important. But I think there is also a role for the quiet actors who do speak to all parties. And like it or not, the humanitarian enterprise is seen as by those who are not like-minded as a project of the Western like-minded world. If you are in China, or if you are speaking to an Islamist jihadist organization, they don't think of you as neutral at all. I am myself a former humanitarian worker, former UN civil servant, they don't perceive it like that at all. And if you listen to a lot of the discourse in the Western like-minded world, frankly, nor do they. I thought the earlier session today on wrestling with, are we neutral, are we impartial in Ukraine, gave it. So we are, like it or not, a neutral organization. We're a low-profile organization. I don't think everybody should be like that, but I think that somebody has to be. And I think coming conflicts, much larger conflicts, probably, which could involve China or could involve other players in the global system, will even more call for those players who can be quiet. And so that is one aspect of making it work. The other thing, if I maybe just can finish on, is, the humanitarian system has become so vast, as well as so public, and so therefore, caught in a polarized public debate, but so vast, it's become a sort of, not humanitarian in the sense originally envisaged by Henri Dunant or the founders of the humanitarian enterprise. It's become sort of almost a sort of welfare system of last resort to hundreds of millions of people around the world on a chronic basis. And that has made it incredibly visible. It's made it incredibly institutionalized and not always very agile. And so it's not, in my view, so much that it's caught up in principles. Martin said it has to be focused on a goal, but there are structures and approaches that militate against flexibility. Eden, you mentioned northwestern Syria. I mean, northwestern Syria is a shame to us all, and I put myself in this category too.
I was just going to ask you for a failure of humanitarian diplomacy.
4 million people basically got nothing at the time of maximum need. And, I won't name names, but I happened to see in the days after the earthquake, 2 of the largest, it doesn't include this, neither of them is Martin, I should say, of the international system in the days after. And both of them said to me separately, both of them run multi-billion-dollar humanitarian organizations. And both of them said to me, we're really focusing on cross-line. And, I thought, WTF, the goal is not, focusing on cross-line. The goal is focusing on how to save lives. And one of them, and when I said it, sort of, or maybe just half said it, one of them said to me, we could go in cross-border, but, it's really important to us that we make a point that we can work across line. But, that is the contrary of what Martin was talking about. Martin said, you focus on a goal. The goal is saving lives. I also, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the people who run northwestern Syria, they are a jihadist group, they are a sanctioned group, but they are not an irrational group. In many ways, it's easier to talk to HTS than it is to talk to the Taliban, and we all line up to talk to the Taliban. But we don't do it, as Martin suggested, in a way which identifies your first goal and pursues it like crazy. There was a line of us standing at Mr. Assad's door in Damascus saying, can I please have access there? And it all got bogged down in squabbles about whether the SARC, the Syrian Arab Red Cross, should be involved, and nothing got through. I think 5 or 6 trucks from the UN got through in about a week. Absolutely nothing from the International Committee of the Red Cross or other providers. And essentially, it's a failure of humanitarian diplomacy. And and I say it on even on the less visible actors, because we too found ourselves constrained there. So all I can really say is I greatly affirm Martin's vision of a diplomacy towards a humanitarian end, which uses a wider set of political means and is able to operate a little bit quietly, so it's away from the public scrutiny such as we saw in this morning's session, which makes it essentially impossible to speak to a government like, say, Russia.
I want to come to our other panelists and welcome to our final one, but Adam, I just want to quickly get your reaction to what David's saying in terms of the failure of the traditional, as he calls it, Western-minded humanitarian sector to engage with these actors that you could otherwise be, getting some traction with.
Let me step back and give you the failure. Humanitarian action needs to expand its borders to 194 member states. We have 194 member states in the UN, and here I'm talking UN. That's what the beauty of this panel. We've got different different complementary perspectives. 194 member states, and yet we traditionally in the humanitarian system, we tend to focus on a group and not everybody, not the entirety of the member states, the membership. We also need to channel our energy into the regional organizations. We all know around this room today that regional organizations, ASEANs and the SADCs and the AUs and organizations of Islamic cooperation and others have really been instrumental, the GCC, in supporting humanitarian action. We need to do much more of that. And if you step back and you look at, for example, the African Union over the last few years, it's set up a humanitarian division. How do we work with them? How do we leverage those relationships? How do we work with ASEAN? 2008, Cyclone Nargis, some of you remember, there was no way in until ASEAN stepped in and supported us in getting in. We talked about the responsibility to protect and all of that. It didn't work. The ASEAN member states supported. We're trying to do the same today, fast forward 2022, 2021. We know what happened in Myanmar. How do we get the regional organizations to support us? So I think stepping away, looking at the regions, that's number one. Number two, the non-traditional member states. We call them the non-traditional, but who's non-traditional? We need to change our language. We need to really engage in certain, when the Ukraine war, when the conflict started, we, as OCHA, some of you around the table were already in Moscow. We established a quick presence in Moscow, supported by the Secretary General, with the Department of Safety and Security and OCHA to start engaging. We talk about the humanitarian notification system. You have to talk to all parties to ensure that assistance reaches people the fastest way possible. We are in Turkey. OCHA is not in, for example, China. How do we engage with some of these key member states? And David, you talked about, of course, and thank you for the points also on the Black Sea grain deal. We had a neutral broker. What country was it? Turkey. And that's when, of course, we brought different forces together, Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, we had, UNCTAD, we had WFP and, maritime colleagues and all of that. A really different state of affairs. You look at Mariupol and what happened in Mariupol. It was a joint, OCHA, ICRC engagement last year. The things have to be looked at completely differently. And as you said, and David, you've talked about it as well, making sure that we're speaking to everybody. And who are the member states we need to leverage? And stop the usual traditional member states that we go to who've been extremely helpful. Even they are asking, I think it came up in the opening today, how do you broaden the donor base? How do you strengthen our ability as humanitarians to understand that we cannot do the same business as usual when we're asking for, what, $54 billion in 2023? Targeting 1 in every 23 people in the globe today needs humanitarian assistance, sorry. So can we continue to do what we're doing? Look at the news today. What is happening with, it's in the news. You've seen it broken on BBC, Al Jazeera, everything that's happening today. China, Iran, Saudi Arabia. We're entering uncharted waters, and we really need to leverage this. We have to look at things differently, and bringing the West and the South and the North and the East together to really look at what the humanitarian needs are. How do we influence humanitarian action differently? And there'll be opportunities to talk, but thanks a lot. This is a momentum we need to seize, and I think everybody recognizes that. Thank you.
Je veux maintenant nous donner un exemple très concret des situations qu'on vient de discuter. Alors, je viens vers vous, Monsieur Al-Mahdi Agwakina, directeur des programmes de l'Association malienne pour la survie au Sahel. Prenez-nous au Mali, c'est un contexte hyper compliqué. David vient de décrire en fait que les négociations avec les islamistes, ça peut se faire, mais on n'a pas les systèmes en place pour le faire. Donnez-nous une idée de votre environnement au quotidien vis-à-vis des défis d'accès et comment vous les gérez.
Allô. Bonsoir. Merci pour cette opportunité qui m'est offerte pour pouvoir parler de cette question lancinante et qui est à l'ordre du jour. Vous savez, la question de l'aide humanitaire n'est pas en fait la première visée pour un départ. Mais cette aide dans la zone centrale du Mali et du Nord, elle est confrontée quand même à de multiples contraintes d'accès. Et cela est illustré en fait par un environnement, par le rétrécissement de l'espace humanitaire. Et ce rétrécissement de l'espace humanitaire en fait est une conséquence d'un environnement sécuritaire complexe, parce que nous avons plusieurs acteurs sur le terrain, une multitude de groupes armés qui sont là. Nous avons bien sûr les groupes radicaux sur le terrain, nous avons les milices d'autodéfense, nous avons aussi les forces de sécurité aussi qui sont là, qui sont en train de faire des opérations de grandes envergures, mais aussi nous avons des acteurs de stabilisation. Donc nous avons un ensemble, une panoplie d'acteurs. Et cette panoplie d'acteurs fait que, des fois, nous ne savons pas qui fait l'humanitaire, qui ne fait pas l'humanitaire, parce que, des fois, les forces de défense aussi mènent des actions civilo-militaires. Et la même chose, nous avons les acteurs humanitaires qui sont là. Donc, ce qui fait que, des fois, il n'y a pas une très bonne distinction du mandat de chaque acteur, ce qui pose vraiment des grandes problématiques sur le terrain. Et parfois aussi, il y a la perception des acteurs humanitaires. Cette perception, elle est fréquente, cette mauvaise perception, parce que des fois, les autorités administratives et les populations ne voient pas vraiment l'impact des millions de francs qui sont déversés sur le terrain. Donc cette perception fait que, des fois, on est amené à certaines restrictions et même des interdictions d'intervention, parce que si vous prenez un peu le cas du Mali et du Burkina, il y a eu des opérations de cash transfert qui ont été arrêtées. Ça a été arrêté parce qu'on pense qu'il n'y a pas une certaine visibilité, une certaine transparence dans l'allocation de ces ressources-là. Et au-delà de ça, vous savez, c'est un environnement aussi où il y a des mines un peu partout. Et les engins explosifs, ce qui fait aussi qu'il y a quand même des dispositifs qui sont extrêmement difficiles pour aller pour accéder à ces populations.
El Mahdi, est-ce que je peux vous demander, parce que vous dites, c'est très intéressant que vous dites que les restrictions sont à cause de manque de confiance dans les acteurs humanitaires. Qu'est-ce que vous faites comme groupe local pour pouvoir accéder à ces populations dans ce contexte avec cette méfiance et ce manque de confiance?
En fait, en tant qu'acteur local, malgré tout cet environnement hostile et austère, les acteurs locaux continuent d'intervenir sur le terrain parce qu'ils ont un certain ancrage communautaire et ils ont cette acceptance au niveau communautaire. Donc là, c'est à travers, bien sûr, les mécanismes traditionnels qui sont là, parce qu'au niveau au niveau communautaire, il y a des mécanismes de prévention et de gestion de conflits qui sont là. Et c'est ce qui a fait que, de 2018 à 2021, il y a eu à peu près dans la zone de Mopti la signature de 14 pactes de paix entre les différentes communautés pour pouvoir vraiment faciliter l'accès et même l'accès des populations pour aller vers le champ. Par exemple, vous voyez le pacte qui a été signé le 19 janvier 2019 à Kewa, c'est une commune du cercle de Guinée. Cet accord a permis vraiment la levée du blocus sur Kouakrou et la circulation sur le long du fleuve a été permise. Donc voilà, c'est des cas d'exemple vraiment d'initiatives locales. Et là, je pense que c'est là que les acteurs locaux et les structures locales peuvent jouer un grand rôle.
Et est-ce que la communauté internationale vous utilise? Est-ce que il peut? This I'm going to struggle to translate, so I'll let the professionals do it. Are they able to leverage your access as a local accepted player that can negotiate with Islamists in a way that maybe they can't, or are you left out of those diplomacy processes?
En fait, par rapport à la question du travail avec les organismes internationaux et même les agences, c'est qu'au niveau central, par exemple, il y a des groupes de travail accès qui ont été créés. Et ces groupes de travail accès impliquent aussi bien les ONG internationales que les ONG national. Mais là, par rapport à ces groupes de travail au niveau national, nous avons pensé que ce qui serait vraiment très utile, c'est vraiment de faire un travail à la base. Parce que toutes les problématiques sont au niveau de la base, parce que ce sont les communautés que nous servons. Ce sont ces communautés qui sont en besoin. Donc je pense que leur implication dans ces dispositifs de négociation, dans ce travail de négociation, il est crucial pour arriver à des résultats pérennes. Mais ces résultats pérennes ne peuvent pas aussi survivre s'il n'y a pas une appropriation des différents mécanismes au niveau régional et au niveau national. Donc,
mais vous dites que ça prend place, là, avec les groupes d'accès, ou que ça ne prend pas place?
C'est en train de prendre place, mais jusqu'à présent, l'initiative toujours vient du niveau national. Mais ce que nous voulons aujourd'hui, c'est vraiment une diplomatie humanitaire ascendante, pas une diplomatie humanitaire descendante.
Okay, so looking for much more of a grassroots approach to humanitarian diplomacy rather than a top-down approach. I'm going to move. It just so happened that organically they sat down in the order that I wanted to speak to them, but move on to Camilla Vasenk, the Executive Director of Partnerships and Policy at the Norwegian Refugee Council. NRC and Jan Egeland, your head, has been very big on access and proximity. I'm curious, we've heard a little bit from El Mehdi about where humanitarian diplomacy isn't necessarily leveraging the local networks as much as it could. Where humanitarian diplomacy isn't working from your experience, why is that? What is missing? And what do you need from the so-called system to be able to do this work at a greater scale?
Thank you. And, oh, it's actually working. That's great. Thank you, Heba. And thank you for inviting NRC to sit in this panel. No, I think, well, you explained very well now the sort of complexities of access in a country like Mali and an increasing number of countries where we work. And I think, you know, as an operational agency, and I think many in this room will recognize this, we are constantly living this tension between access, being able to deliver aid, and then on the other hand, doing advocacy, you know, private advocacy, but also speaking out on protection issues and access issues and so on. And I think what we have felt in many cases was that, you know, in cases where we have been penalized, and we have for speaking out, and as you know, our Jan Egeland is a fairly outspoken person. So we respect, you know, different agencies have different approaches to public advocacy, for instance. But at the same time, what we feel often is, you know, there's a lack of coordination. I think, I mean, you mentioned the access working groups just now. I think that is a great tool, in fact, for, you know, joint information gathering, analysis, for developing common positions. But of course, that is an advisory tool to the humanitarian country team, to the humanitarian coordinator. So we also then rely, of course, on the leadership at that level to really take on these issues. And then speaking with one voice, that is what we need, but I think too often we see that the humanitarian community is not really speaking with one voice. I think, and it's difficult, I think, for actors at the national level. I mean, they are under enormous pressure, often political pressures, they're under pressure to deliver aid and so on. So that's also where we need higher level, we need capitals engaged, we need the higher level engaged and in support of country level colleagues, because they are the ones that are most exposed, but they also need to be held accountable, of course. So we're quite excited and really welcome this new initiative now from the ERC of sort of strengthening collective advocacy by the Interagency Standing Committee principles, because we think that there's a lot to gain on that, you know, more solidarity, more collective approaches. And we're supporting that directly as well with one of our senior staff. Then I think also it was said that, you know, there are no humanitarian solutions, Idem said it, no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian issues, and I think there also it needs to, we are spending a lot of time talking among ourselves, of course, but we need, you know, political actors engaged, we need diplomats engaged, and we need to do that at all levels, I think. We need to do it at country level. We see, you know, very challenging countries, like Nigeria, for instance, where it's very difficult because there are many other agendas at the same time, and the humanitarian issues is just one agenda, and it's often not necessarily the one that wins out. So we need engagement across, and then we need, of course, then engagement by, you know, from capital level, from regional organization. I think that was a very important point that was made. You know, the African Union, there's a new African Union Humanitarian Agency. What role could that play potentially? We have, of course, the EU, good, I think, mechanisms like the senior officials meetings in certain contexts and so on. We have this forum here, but again, I think there's an attempt, of course, to engage beyond the humanitarian sector, but it's often difficult, right, to really get the political leadership involved. So I think those are, and of course, as was mentioned, we need to no longer, I mean, the context that we're talking about, it is not, you know, the like-minded Western donor states that necessarily have the influence in these contexts, whether we're talking about the Sahel, Myanmar, Afghanistan, and so on. So we need to engage much more broadly, and as a humanitarian community, we're not good enough at that. I mean, we're starting to do it as NRC, but it's still too ad hoc. You know, we don't know enough sort of what, you know, the interests are, how to leverage different actors, and so on. And I think, again, much more coordinated approaches where also states need to reach out much more consistently to others and talk to the people that we're not maybe as confident in talking to. It's more comfortable in a way to be in this room and talk to the ones we normally talk to. So those are a few things I would mention. Thank you.
I'm curious, you talked about basically the balance between speaking out and maintaining access. And if you take the example of Afghanistan right now, a number of aid organizations have basically abandoned access in the name of principles. So if you're not going to let us work if we don't have female staff, then we're not going to work at all. And who is losing as a result of that principled stance? So how are you navigating that tension between taking a principled stance and then, you know, ensuring that you're actually helping the people in need?
Thank you.
You've been kicked out of many countries because of your principled stance.
Well, usually we are able to resume operations at some point, but I mean, no, I mean, it's of course very, very difficult discussions. I mean, I would say it's difficult discussions, you know, internally, it's difficult discussions in the community, and these are very, very hard choices to make. I think in that particular case, you know, I think for us, it's an absolute sort of principled stance that we need to maintain. Of course, we are still trying, of course, and we hope to negotiate access, and we are doing it at different levels. You know, we are engaging all the way to the top to see if we can change this policy. And we believe it's important, again, to have a collective approach. I think, you know, if we start getting split into different groups, then it's very difficult to maintain that position. So, I mean, in some cases, we believe that is the right choice, and we have to do it, but it's not easy. And of course, we are resuming operations in some areas where we have now been able to use, you know, where our female staff can work, and we hope that will be expanded. But we need then everyone with us, of course. We need the other agencies, we need the UN, when we need donors and so on to support that approach.
I want to come back to this question of a collective approach because that's something OCHA is working on. But I'm going to pick up one of the questions from the Slido because it's linked to what we're just talking about. Should we limit or even forget consent when a government blocks access, for example, in Syria, although Afghanistan would be, I mean, there are endless cases. And if yes, what about safety for staff and volunteers? Does anyone want to have a crack at that? And then I'm going to come to you, Anton.
Yes. Okay. I think drawing on the instinctive word that comes to mind is balance. How do you balance, not the second part about safety and security, because you can't balance that. And let's not forget that 98% of aid workers that are killed are nationals of the country where we serve. So there's that. It's absolutely a non-negotiable point for us that humanitarian workers are killed. Absolutely not acceptable. But we are caught in the line of fire. On the first one about consent, it's a balance. And I think I want to pick up on Camilla's point as well and other points that were made earlier. We have to consistently, as a humanitarian community, balance between quiet diplomacy and public diplomacy. I remember in one context where I worked, we had issued about 50 HC statements in 2 years condemning, you know, different issues related to attacks on humanitarians, on access, on blockade, you know, all the things that we like to do, you know, on what Elmedi raised about bureaucratic impediments and all of that. We had put out 50 statements, and yet it wasn't enough. But we couldn't highlight, I think, David, your point as well, the behind the scenes, and Martin raised that as well, the balanced approach on the quiet, hard talk negotiations with the governments where we work. There's also, at one point, and it's not just NRC, many NGOs, many actors have said, that's enough. We've had our aid workers kidnapped, we're not going to do this anymore. We have to also take a stance. So it's not a yes and no, black and white response at all. You have agencies that have lost a lot, and I don't want to put any agency on the spot, but in some of the contexts that I've worked in the last 10 years, certainly, some agencies would go to a government and say, okay, that's it. You're no longer able to protect our staff, you're no longer able to support us, but of course, as humanitarians, you also have to talk to non-state armed groups. So one point that hasn't come up yet, and I think, Almighty, your point, community engagement, the grassroots. Who is in the communities that who are in the communities that we serve? So you have the government, it's not monolithic. There are different levels. The grassroots, local authorities, then you have the state level in some contexts, then you have the federal level in some contexts, capital level in countries where, of course, it's not a federation. And, again, has been raised. Engaging with all actors at all levels at all times is necessary.
But how good are humanitarians at doing that, really? Because this kind of stakeholder mapping is quite a different approach than I'm coming in with my rice and I'm going to distribute my rice in my way through my channels. How good are humanitarians at doing that kind of stakeholder mapping of, I need to be engaging at all these different levels to have the impact that I want?
I think we called it back in the day, 20 years ago and maybe before that, protection by presence. We have to be at the lowest, at the grassroots levels. We have different agencies, what we call, the local NGOs, the civil society organizations on the front lines where we engage in their coordination. We've called it area-based coordination in different contexts, the ABCs, the local-based coordination mechanisms and all of that. Then we have capital-based coordination mechanisms. We are not great at it, Heba, you're right, but we're trying our best to ensure that we are connecting all the dots at all different levels.
Trying our best. I'm gonna put you on pause, Adam, for a minute and come back to you, but because I do want to get to Anton. But there's the theme of the question so far, which is around this issue of what do you do when the government is not playing game. A second question that Martin Griffiths was in Burkina Faso, where the transitional military authorities were preventing assistance for people at the brink of famine. So what happens when humanitarian diplomacy fails? What's the plan B? I know you wanted to come in earlier, David.
Well, I mean, my first point is that we don't even try plan A. I mean, far too often we allow ourselves to be held hostage by essentially malevolent governments. So in Burkina Faso, maybe being an example, but I would say in Syria, the reason nobody got helped in northwestern Syria, 4 million people were exposed to that terrible earthquake and got no assistance at all, essentially, is because we followed, if I may say so, I said this as a former UN civil servant, a sort of UN, there are 194 sovereign state logic, but in fact there are many more entities in the world than politically, militarily controlled entities, and many of them have suffering people, and because they're unattractive, many of them are under sanctions and so on, but whether it's the Houthi-controlled territories in Yemen, whether it's parts of the Sahel controlled by the jihadis, and I very much agreed with your comments that actually although the governments don't like it, you can work, at least with the Janim, for example, and some of the jihadist groups, you can. So I would say, before we talk about plan B, let's first focus again on plan A, as Martin suggested at the beginning, which is identify people in need and find the diplomatic path to helping them. Because it is possible to speak to the HTS. The UN has decided to accept, a Russian bloc, essentially, on cross-border aid into northwest Syria. There are also problems in northeast Syria, access to the Houthis, access to the Sahel, access to eastern Congo. And
what does that mean the UN has decided to accept it?
Shouldn't put up with it.
But what does it mean if Russia blocks it?
No.
What options does the UN have in a case like that?
I think in northwestern Syria, to be fair, I think actually OCHA is now thinking of trying to set up an office in Idlib, and I think that they are informing the government of Syria rather than asking for permission. But and it's not just limited, but until now they have accepted what the government of Syria and Russia have demanded in terms of its distribution of personnel on the ground and its points of entry in there.
So you're looking for them to be more ballsy, basically?
I think that the first criteria is humanity. And humanity is about saving lives, and saving lives is about access. The United Nations, but it's not just the United Nations, is about states and what states agree to. But the ICRC, if one is broadening it a bit, also doesn't have access on the ground essentially in northwestern Syria. And that's because they accept the rules laid down by the Syrian government. And I think that the vision of humanitarian diplomacy has to be a vision of diplomacy put at the service not of states and their global or regional organizations, but individuals in need and the diplomacy required to access those individuals. And as the Malian civil society groups, these pacts made in the Mopti area around central Mali are a beautiful thing and an illustration of just what you can do even when the government doesn't go along with it.
I want to turn to Anton, who's been waiting patiently. He was late because he came straight from the Syria-Turkey Pledging Conference, but he is the director of the Spanish Agency for International Development Cooperation, Anton Garcia, and you have just launched a whole strategy about humanitarian diplomacy. Tell us a bit about how that advances this work, but also we've been discussing the role of governments a fair bit. We started, you missed it, I think, but with a look at how part of the challenge is that Western governments are really driving a lot of humanitarian diplomacy, and there's a need to engage with other governments from different parts of the world. But also, I think David just mentioned it, the question of sanctions really getting in the way as well of some of this diplomacy in terms of being able to speak to so-called terrorists. So I'd love to hear, in addition to your strategy, your view of the role that governments can be playing in contributing to humanitarian diplomacy.
Well, thank you very much, and I apologize for being late. I hate people being late, and I hate to be late myself. But indeed, I think this is partly the product of this myriad of humanitarian crises. I was in Brussels Friday evening in the Venezuela Pledging Conference, and I'm here again on Monday talking Turkey and Syria. Look, I think there are two things here, or two roles that governments can play in all of this. Number one is we can finance, and we do. And I think it's not in the context we are living in with this explosion of humanitarian needs. It's about doing more, and certainly we are playing our part. We just adopted a new law on development cooperation and global solidarity, where we clearly carve out a space for humanitarian aid, which is not development cooperation. It is not, and partly because we are talking about all these issues of access, international humanitarian law. And we are we set out an ambitious objective for us. We are at 0.34% of GDP for ODA at the moment. We want to reach 0.7 in 2030, but we want to devote at least 10% of that to humanitarian action. So we need to finance, so we need to do more. We need to support humanitarian actors such as those represented on this panel. But we need to do better. And I think that's where I would make the connection with the second role that states have, which is humanitarian diplomacy. When we talk access, when we talk international humanitarian law, often we think of the hallways of New York, Geneva, or Brussels. But this is something that needs to be grounded also at the local level, in capitals. And not just by humanitarians, it's in capitals by our diplomats, talking to ministries, talking to different people, probably not to some of the actors that we states feel more uncomfortable with, but that's the role that other people in this panel can pick up. Our strategy is very important. We just, as you said, we just adopted not just a new law, but we are changing many things at the moment in Spain. We're increasing our resources, but we also adopted a humanitarian diplomacy strategy. And I think having a strategy is important. First of all, you are signaling the importance of this, that this is something that is not just the job of humanitarians, it's the job of diplomats and it's the job of politicians. We need to be emphasizing the question of access, emphasizing the need to respect international humanitarian law. There is a lot of disinformation and stigmatization of humanitarian actors that are at the root cause of some of these access problems. And I think that's where this strategy, that has 3 pillars, but one of them, and the first one actually, and that's not a coincidence, is the protection of humanitarian space. And as I said, we focus on things like disinformation, stigmatization, but also importantly, localization. It's very important that these diplomatic efforts take place at all levels, including at the local levels, and are coordinating between different actors. This, what we're trying to do by having a strategy is also to signal certain causes we care about. Like, we're talking access now, but let's also talk like protection of healthcare workers, security. We need, and that's another role. When we finance, we need to fund also the security of our workers. 2 years ago, we lost a Spanish national, an MSF employee, together with 2 Ethiopian colleagues in Ethiopia. That created a big outcry in Spanish public opinion. And all this requires donors at the end. And of course, we have the incentive to support, let's say, specific interventions, working with OCHA, like saving lives, protection, refugees, you name it. But we need to earmark some of these resources also for these diplomatic in the broader sense efforts of talking to political actors, talking to state actors, that's our role, talking to non-state actors as well, because if there is no access, there is no humanitarian effort. And that's very clear. We're seeing it in Afghanistan. I mentioned Turkey and Syria. Other people have referred to the question of Syria. Our challenge there has been in Turkey, we had access. In northwestern Syria, that has been more difficult. We work in the Sahel as well, and there it is indeed very difficult to get access to some of the... And by the way, on this point, I think the role of local actors in some areas is absolutely important and fundamental. I think most UN agencies do a fantastic job at getting local and talking to people, talking to everyone, getting access. We managed to get humanitarian aid into Syria, abiding by humanitarian principles and international humanitarian law through UN agencies. But sometimes, in some contexts, it's actually the local actors that have that level of access that we need to deliver the aid that our taxpayers are financing. So
you're saying that you're actually going to earmark within your strategy funding specifically for humanitarian diplomacy, which could actually include diplomats speaking to other diplomats, and that you see that under the umbrella of humanitarianism?
Well, we are, as I said, I mean, number one priority in our strategy is indeed this one of the protection of the humanitarian space. And there is, of course, the salaries of diplomats that need to spend probably more time than they spend, and I'm not just thinking of our missions, let's say in New York, Geneva, or in Brussels. I'm thinking of our diplomats in Mali, or in Venezuela, or in Syria. What I think is indeed very important is that we spend also some money on supporting, doing capacity building of local actors in, making sure that these networks are built. And so it's not necessarily spending money on diplomats. We are paying them
no, I didn't
monthly
mean
salary.
it in a negative way, but
it is true that we need money that is being spent on these efforts as well, like on campaigns, in certain cases, awareness. We are seeing the case of Ukraine. 2,300 schools have been destroyed. If you look at infrastructure, there seems to be some targeting of schools, but just by looking at the numbers. These are causes that Spain has supported for several years. Education in emergencies, protection of healthcare workers. We need to spend money of that as part of our humanitarian efforts. It's not just about programs on protection, refugees, you name it. It's also about these other efforts that are crucial for humanitarians to operate in the ground.
And coming back to the diplomats, because I find it interesting because a lot of the issues we've been talking about are actually linked to the UN Security Council, right? And so it is the diplomats that are doing the heavy lifting in terms of access. Have you found examples where, as a Western state, you have been able to diplomatically secure breakthroughs with the likes of Russia or China? How likely is that scenario?
It's very difficult at the moment, I would say. But there have been some examples, and I think OCHA alluded to this. A colleague told me before I arrived at what is happening with the Black Sea Initiative. It shows that in certain circumstances, in the worst of circumstances, some things can happen, and we need to preserve to the extent we can those spaces.
I've been asking a lot of questions. I'm sure you all have some as well. I'm going to turn to one person in the audience. Alvaro Di Vicente, are you here? Yes, okay. So Alvaro is the head of the regional office for Latin America and the Caribbean at ECHO. And I wanted him to share with us some takeaways from regional consultations that were held in the lead up to this forum in Latin America and Africa on this question of a more coordinated approach to humanitarian diplomacy, which did, as I understand it, come up from the participants. So keen to hear what they said and then start getting your questions ready.
Yes, thank you. Yes, as you mentioned, there were some two regional consultations that were held in Panama for Latin America and the Caribbean, in Dakar for Africa. So basically, there was a consensual, let's say, for both sessions, that is an unanimous plea to institutional donors to support coordination on humanitarian access and to facilitate the safeguard of humanitarian space through the allocation of financial resources, as you were mentioning before, because this is not for free, and through the engagement on advocacy, and also ensuring that humanitarian development and peace initiatives do not jeopardize the protection of the population and the humanitarian space, because otherwise the nexus is just not possible. We are talking about a nexus that cannot be done like this. Concretely in Dakar, there was an ask to the EU and its member states to promote frameworks where IHL and access challenges can be discussed in an inclusive way between African continental regional organizations, authorities, UN, NGOs, donors, and diplomatic focal points. This is also what was mentioned before, but you to work more through regional levels. Also, they ask to the EU and to the UN office, to the African Union, to ensure that legislative frameworks are conducive to humanitarian assistance, notably through the inclusion of humanitarian exceptions in the counterterrorism legislation and regulations. And last one, they ask to the EU donors and ERC to push for greater accountability of all actors for a more principled action. The case in Latin America was a bit more specific and different. The first request was to raise the visibility on a situation that is forgotten, because in general, when we are talking about humanitarian access, we don't speak about the situations in this region. We are talking about a region in which 3 out of the 7 most severe conflicts in the world are there. Notably, we're talking about Haiti, we're talking about Colombia, we're talking about Mexico. But we don't think that the fact that these conflicts are not generally falling under the IHL framework, this is not a reason not to include them in the global agenda of humanitarian access to protect the humanitarian space. The second point in Latin America and the Caribbean is also because this is a phenomenon with organized crime, gangs, and armed groups. This is a situation that is new for many humanitarian stakeholders, and there is a need to bring humanitarian diplomacy expertise on the ground to deal with organized crime and with gangs. And the last one is also to promote the creation of a regional mechanism, okay, of humanitarian access, which would enable joint analysis of access constraints and would support, connect, and complement existing national and local efforts that already exist in many of the countries and locations, not everywhere. So these were the main outcomes. If you are interested, the reports are uploaded in the website of the conference, and if you want more information, feel free to contact the regional office in Dakar or the regional office in Panama. Thank you.
Very interesting. And so some pretty clear requests for help, basically, in doing humanitarian diplomacy on the ground through financing, through exemptions to sanctions, and through joint analysis. I want to quickly turn to you, Edem, but really quickly so that we can fit in some questions. OCHA is now trying to ramp up its ability to support field actors in doing humanitarian diplomacy, so maybe just walk us through what you're trying to put into place.
Thanks a lot, Heba, and thank you for the advocacy also for a region that sometimes is forgotten. Just speaking up on Haiti, for example, and the colleague from ECHO just talked about, armed gangs. This is a whole new level of I don't know what word to use, but we're really struggling with a completely different context in Haiti, for example. And we're looking at different approaches on how to deal with a context which has not been very popular, you know, a bit of maybe uncharted territory. Let me use that phrase. We're talking to anybody who can support us with getting through to the armed groups. By alluding to the Humanitarian Negotiations Unit that was recently set up. It's in the Response Support Branch. It's about how do we work, finding different solutions to different contexts, things that we haven't approaches that we haven't done before. So for Haiti, the team worked with the humanitarian coordinator and the OCHA office and the country team to map out a really detailed, you talked about it earlier, stakeholder analysis. Who can speak to these gang leaders? We need to talk to them. Haiti is diabolical. The rape cases are awful. You know, the new Humanitarian put out last week, Friday. And thank you for those updates. Summary of what you call the cheat sheet, and I always read them. What is happening?
As you all should.
Sorry.
As everyone else should.
As everyone, please do. She hasn't paid me at all. It's really good to look at the cheat sheets, and you know what's happening in Haiti is awful. And how do we ensure that we talk to whoever we need to talk to negotiate with whoever we need to get to that child?
But Adam, tell us what OCHA is going to do to make that easier for people.
Stakeholder analysis, supporting in different contexts. We are right now, the Humanitarian Negotiations Unit is dealing with countries, contexts for Latin America, Colombia and Haiti, just specifically on Latin America. We've also engaged with our teams in Somalia, with our teams in Afghanistan, parts of the Black Sea Green Deal, and so on. A different approach. And you know, when you're on the ground working on humanitarian issues on a daily basis, you don't have time to take a moment and sit back and say, let's map XYZ. We also have, my last point, a really stretched humanitarian situation globally, right? Haiti had 2 or 3 people from OCHA. We're ramping up our efforts there. This is because we realize that, of course, we can't be everywhere. We can't be everywhere at all times, but there are certain crises. Haiti goes down in the sub-region, it will affect tremendously what's happening in the different contexts as well. I know it's 2 seconds, but I have a lot more to say when I get the moment. Thanks.
You can find her afterwards. Questions from the audience? Oh, okay. In that case, I'm going to take one question here.
Merci. Tout d'abord, je vous remercie de m'avoir donné la parole. Je me remercie les panélistes. C'est une thématique très importante, la démocratie, quand on parle de la diplomatie humanitaire. Donc moi, je m'appelle M. Al-Hussein Amidou. Je suis le président de la synergie des ONG humanitaires pour les actions humanitaires au Niger. Voilà, je viens du Niger, donc du Sahel. Nous vivons ce problème d'accès au Niger, qui est un problème trop préoccupant pour les ONG nationales. Donc, en 2022, nous avons vécu ce même problème. Nous avons des problèmes de la diplomatie humanitaire, problèmes d'accès causés d'abord par l'État. L'État peut signer des décrets pour empêcher les humanitaires d'aller dans tel point ou telle zone. Nous avons des problèmes humanitaires causés par les militaires eux-mêmes, qui empêchent les humanitaires à avoir accès à des zones. Et nous avons des problèmes d'accès causés par les terroristes, les gangs, qui nous empêchent aussi d'avoir accès à ces zones-là. Le premier problème, celui du gouvernement. Nous avons vécu un exemple qui a alerté l'humanitaire, tous les humanitaires au Niger. À travers ça, nous sommes confrontés à un problème où l'État refuse à ce que les humanitaires aient accès à des zones. Et pourtant, nous avons des personnes vulnérables qui sont sur le terrain, des personnes qui ont besoin vraiment d'être sauvées, hein, des femmes, des enfants, des personnes vulnérables dans cette zone-là. Donc, il a fallu trouver la solution. La solution, c'était quoi? C'était la coordination. Il y avait une coordination des acteurs, c'est-à-dire humanitaires, à travers la coordinatrice humanitaire du pays, la représentation des ONG nationales, dont je suis même membre du comité, la représentation des ONG internationales, la représentation des bailleurs et la représentation des CICR.
Et qu'est-ce qu'ils ont fait avec cette coordination?
Pardon?
Qu'est-ce qu'ils ont réussi à faire?
Oui, nous avons mis une coordination, c'est-à-dire un comité de haut niveau, présidé par le Premier ministre, inclut les membres du gouvernement. À travers cette coordination, nous sommes arrivés à résoudre des problèmes. Il n'est pas dit qu'on a eu toutes les solutions, mais quand même certaines solutions ont été levées. Et ça nous a permis d'avancer. Donc la diplomatie humanitaire, elle se situe au niveau de la coordination, au niveau de politique. On ne peut pas la faire sans les politiques. Mais bien sûr, au niveau local, à travers les ONG aussi nationales. Il y a des stratégies qui sont menées en bas avec les ONG nationales, qui sont parfois sous-entendues, mais vraiment qui marchent.
Je vous remercie, monsieur. C'est un exemple très intéressant pour voir comment on peut intégrer tous les acteurs pour pouvoir négocier un peu plus avec le gouvernement. Je vais devoir vous arrêter parce qu'on n'a plus de temps. Je prends encore un commentaire et puis on va revenir au panel pour les dernières questions.
La question que je voudrais savoir, que je voudrais poser, c'est par rapport au droit. Pour le cas du Niger, négocier avec les terroristes est un crime pour l'État. Et quelles sont les garanties pour nous, les humanitaires, si jamais nous nous engageons dans ce sens-là?
Okay, parfait. So what protections are in place for humanitarians? I'm going to give this to you, Anton, in negotiating with terrorists. I'm going to take one more comment from Ambassador Julieta Noyes, who is just here in the front row, Assistant Secretary for Population, Refugees, and Migration at the U.S. State Department. And then we'll come back to the panel for final thoughts. You're happy to, okay, she's foregoing her slot. So very quickly, the question of sanctions. Anton.
Well, the question of sanctions, that's a complex one. It is in our strategy here, and I think most member states in the EU are converging around this idea of having narrowly defined sanctions on individuals, on specific firms, entities. We need to have broad exceptions, and I think there is a recent UN resolution on this, on providing these blanket exemptions. But this is indeed it's a very complex issue. Everybody knows here the implications. I'm not sure that his question was about the sanctions. I think it was most about the question of protecting humanitarian actors in discussing with specific groups, wasn't it?
Who are
yes,
sanctioned?
Right?
Is that okay?
Yeah. Sorry
anyway,
sorry for rephrasing the question, because that kept me thinking. Because we work a lot on the question of sanctions. Indeed, the sanctions are there. But we need to preserve the space, and we need to promote, and that's something that we put also in the strategy, a dialogue between humanitarian actors as well and the financial sector as well, and financial sector. There is sometimes what happens with sanctions is that they are there is a tendency of some of the financial sector to overshoot, and sometimes sanctions practically they go beyond their specific terms, and I think part of the role, again, of governments, of our humanitarian diplomacy, can be to put in touch the humanitarians and the financial sector as well, to see the practical implementation of those sanctions. But on the question of how is it that we protect humanitarian actors that speak to these groups, well, that's one prime example where I think the involvement, and it's not that just Niger, but in the Sahel generally, we talk to everyone, we talk to the governments, and I think the role of the international community, of our ambassadors, our diplomats, is absolutely key. First of all, to convey the message that access is indeed important, and access in these countries, there are access issues related to groups that control the territory, but it's indeed sometimes there are often problems on the governments themselves, or the bureaucracies, or the military, the police, and so on. And I think that's where our ambassadors, our diplomats, can indeed play a role. And then there is the question as well of protecting the workers and protecting your NGOs and so on. And I think that's, as financiers, we need to spend money. And when we fund these activities, we need to make sure that there is enough funding for security. And that's very clear. I think that's more on our role as financiers to make sure that these that operations such as these ones are actually count on adequate levels of security.
So I was going to ask each of you to close, and I'm going to be very strict about one sentence, one idea, but one practical thing that can be done to make this humanitarian diplomacy more possible? So you just gave one, which is, connecting humanitarian and financial institutions as a way of overcoming the roadblock around the limitations that the financial sector puts forward on humanitarian operations. Camilla, I know you wanted to jump in on sanctions, so maybe your takeaway or practical way forward can be linked to that.
Thank you. No, maybe just two sentences on sanctions. I think, first of all, it's a good example of, even in this dire multilateral environment that we're in at the moment, when the Security Council was able to pass a resolution that provides, a blanket humanitarian exemptions across all UN sanctions regimes, that tells you it's still possible to make progress on some humanitarian issues. Now, I think actually just on that, I think the point also, and it links to the point mentioned by our colleague from Niger here, I think the issue is often also then domestic counterterrorism regulations. And that's where we need a lot more work and a lot more engagement. And they are, just as hampering of humanitarian aid. And I think there's much more need for collective efforts. So it's easy to have collective efforts at global level, but doing it also at the national level, engaging there, which can be more sensitive and more difficult, I think that would be one concrete thing that we would ask for.
What does that look like concretely?
Well, it would mean engaging, across the humanitarian community, but getting donor states engaged, getting other influential actors. I think that's also where other states can have an influence on domestic legislation and more coordinated approaches on that.
Okay, so some kind of vehicle to coordinate at a national level.
Yeah, I don't think we need new vehicles, just use existing coordination fora, but just do it actively.
Okay. El Mehdi, une suggestion pratique pour comment pouvoir faire ce travail au futur?
Ce qui est important, c'est qu'il faut beaucoup agir sur la diplomatie en toute discrétion aussi. La diplomatie humanitaire suppose, dans certains cas, une discrétion. Et c'est pourquoi nous avons dit que la diplomatie humanitaire doit être portée par les communautés qu'on doit sauver et non par les acteurs politiques.
Quelque chose de concret.
Quelque chose de concret.
Oui.
Quand on veut accéder à une zone, il faut mettre devant les leaders communautaires pour pouvoir négocier l'accès.
Okay, that's clear. For any access negotiations, local humanitarians should be leading the negotiations. David?
Yeah, I think I would probably join those on sanctions. I think a fight back from the humanitarian community for humanitarian exception on sanctions. However, that has to be negotiated. I think one of the sort of dirty secrets, in a way, of the Western world is that the sanctions really do terrible, terrible harm to the people in the regimes, in the control of the regimes that are sanctioned, whether it's northwest Syria or the Houthis or previously in Iraq or elsewhere. There is a lot of, frankly, talking out of two sides of the mouth about how food and pharma is not sanctioned, but the reality is nobody will dare engage in those areas. And I think that for all of us who have a commitment to what Martin described at the beginning, which is goal-oriented humanitarian diplomacy, it starts by an absolute insistence that when it comes to saving lives, the humanitarians should be able to have access to absolutely anybody. Thanks.
Okay, humanitarians fighting back. Idem.
Thank you. I have to say something on sanctions because to allude to our Spanish colleague and what he said about, and everyone has said, the humanitarian carve-outs were necessary. And the member states who supported us from 2012, 11, Somalia famine, all the way through today, those detailed conversations with the humanitarians to ensure that there were clear lines of engagement as humanitarians to be able to do what we did. So to the donors who supported us, really, please continue to do more, because I know it's not easy to do that in your different constituents. Concrete examples, complementarities, no competition. We need to stop. The needs are too vast, and I think we've done a great job over the last few years, and we continue to do more working together. And I know you want concrete examples, but this is concrete. Access is huge. Everybody has the role to play. Some are neutral brokers, some are advocates, some are negotiators, some are quiet diplomacy people, some are public diplomacy people. Everyone has a role to play, and we need to come together to push this agenda, because there's no one agency, no one actor that can do it all.
And if I understood what you're saying is that also if one person can do it, everyone else doesn't have to do it. Let them do it. So if one person is doing a visit to God knows where, we don't need every UN agency chief to also go to that place, and that they can focus on advocating somewhere else.
Exactly, and that's the point that Camilla raised about the humanitarian advocacy at the highest level, the interagency standing committee. Really, 2 or 3 agency representatives going to one location rather than having 20 visits 20 times. That is a bit disruptive to humanitarian assistance. Thank you.
Okay, hopefully you've left with a few concrete ideas about how to put humanitarian diplomacy into action to improve access. I know it's also quite a high-level ideas-based conversation, but I hope you've gotten something out of it. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to you for listening.